Welcome to our November Buzz Pick of the Month author event. We're thrilled to have Amor Towles and Gail Vanette here to talk about Amor's latest book, The Lincoln Highway. But first, let's get to know them both a little bit better. Along with The Lincoln Highway, Amor Towles is the author of Rules of Civility and A Gentleman in Moscow, both of which are New York Times bestsellers. The two novels have collectively sold more than 4 million copies and have been translated into more than 30 languages. Gail Vanette has been a buyer in the product department at Ingram Content Group for almost 20 years. Prior to her work as a lead content manager at Ingram, she was a bookseller at a large independent bookstore in Nashville. The Lincoln Highway is on sale now and available at your local independent bookstore. Visit indiebound.org to find an indie in your area. Throughout the conversation today, feel free to use the Q&A box to send in a question. We'll have a Q&A portion towards the end with some of the questions here and those submitted at your registration. Closed captioning is also available at the bottom of your screen. On behalf of Indie Book Buzz and Bookfinity, thank you so much for joining us today, and remember to follow Indie Book Buzz on Instagram and visit bookfinity.com for all the latest BuzzPick news. And now, we're pleased to virtually welcome Gail Vanette and Amor Towles.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to, I guess this is our last Indie Book Buzz of the year. And I can't tell you how delighted I am to welcome Amor Towles. Welcome, Amor. So happy you could join us today. It's just great to see you. Congratulations on Lincoln Highway. It debuted at #1, which many authors wish they could say, and it's still up in the top 10. In fact, I think it's climbed a couple of notches for the list that's coming out on December 5th. So that is just fantastic. It's also in the top, continues to be in the top 10 of the independent bookstores list. And it was a Jenna pick. So just right out of the gate, this book has some real momentum. Could you tell us, well, I want to, there's a lot to talk about. The scope of this book is big. And when I first saw it, when the rep presented it to me, I thought, wait, what about Moscow? I mean, this is very far from Moscow. It's in the United States. It's the summer of 1954. And we start with three 18-year-old young men. I hate to call them boys because they're certainly not boys in the sense that somebody's telling them to, brush their teeth and go to bed, but they're not quite men either. They're just getting started. So could you tell us a little bit about these three young men and the 8-year-old boy who accompanies them on this trip from Nebraska to New York City?
Sure. And first of all, let me say thanks to the team at Ingram for arranging this event, but thanks, Gail, for serving as moderator, but especially thanks to you, booksellers and librarians and readers who have joined us tonight for this conversation, which I hope won't prove to be a waste of your time. But so the Lincoln Highway, as Gail has sort of given some of a rough sense of the book, like all of my books, really sprang from a very simple notion. I generally I've been writing fiction since I was a kid. And over the course of my life, have come up with many ideas for stories or novels. And they tend to come in the form of a sentence or two, sort of a little conceit or a premise, like a guy gets trapped in a hotel for a long period of time. That was the seed of A Gentleman in Moscow, just that notion that kind of struck me. In the case of the Lincoln Highway, the notion was the sort of image almost of a young man who has done some time in a juvenile work camp for a mistake he made, is being driven home by the warden, who was explaining to the young man, our hero Emmett, that what had happened to him was a freak accident, that he's a good person, that he's paid his debt to society, and that he should start his life anew now. And Emmett saying to the warden, that's really his intention. And while Emmett was doing time, his father has died and the family farm is in foreclosure. His mother is long gone. So his goal is really just to get his 8-year-old brother, get in his car and head west to start fresh. But as it happens, when the warden drives away, it turns out the two other kids from the work camp, two friends of his, have hidden in the trunk of the warden's car, and they have a very different sense of what Emmett's near-term future should be. So for me, it really began with this image of the kid being driven home by the warden and two kids hiding in the trunk of the car. You know, that's kind of where I start. And when I have a notion like that, that grabs me, I will just start digging deeper and deeper into the story over a period of years, trying to imagine the story to its full extent, long before I write chapter 1. And this means imagining all the events, the characters, their backgrounds, what they sound like, what they're going to do and why, many elements which don't end up in the novel itself, but are a part of the universe of the novel. All of that gets imagined with care over a period of time and ultimately transferred into notebooks and then into an outline before I write chapter 1. So that's sort of this long, sort of process of getting there. Now, when I'm doing that, I frankly don't think too much about what the book is about. And I trust my instincts about that the story seems compelling, and I follow all the threads to their conclusion as best I can. But when I'm done, I then start to reflect a little bit more on what the story is, and now that it's complete, what does it mean, and et cetera. And one of the things that really struck me in the conclusion of when I'd finished the first draft was that, to some degree, this book really is about that moment in our life when we are about 18. This is going back to your question, Gail. And if you think about that moment in our lives, or take a step back and think about what came before it, between the age of 0 and 16, we all are receiving a constant, steady flow of instruction and guidance from our parents, from school teachers, from our church, from our community at large. This is constant transferal of information, stories, laws, rules, guidance, which are being delivered in the hopes of shaping us and giving us a sense of what is right and wrong, and how we should live our lives, how we should treat others, and to some degree what we're capable of. All that's being transferred to us as we're young children, just sort of taking it in. Now, but sometime around the time we're 17, 18, 19 years old, we suddenly realize that we're actually in charge of that whole thing, that process. That nothing that has been told to us do we need to accept at face value, and that we can begin the process of defining our lives and our identities and our future independently. And now when that moment comes, which is obviously a very exciting moment in many ways for all of us, when that moment comes, either consciously or unconsciously, we may embrace some of the things that were communicated to us as younger people and decide that we're going to amplify them in our lives. Consciously or unconsciously, we may reject some of the things that were told to us as younger people. And that will be a factor in how we go forth. But in either case, it suddenly becomes a business of we ourselves having both the liberty and the responsibility of deciding who we are, who we want to be, what's right and wrong, and what we are capable of. And this story is very much, even though it's only, and I can't remember if you said this, Gail, the whole story takes place over 10 days
Right.
in June of 1954. And over the course of that 10 days, we're getting a glimpse of this moment in the lives of the three young men who are all about the age of 18, Emmett, our hero, and Duchess and Willie, the two men who've hidden in the trunk of the car, and the neighbor, Sally, a young woman who's also about 19 years old or 20, roughly around that, who also is experiencing that same moment in time. So this is a big part, I guess, of thematically of where the story lands.
Right. There's a section in the book where you talk about how children don't know that the way their family life is not normal, let's say, or that anybody lives any differently. And then, as Professor Abernathy, if you haven't read the book, you will meet or hope to meet Professor Abernathy, tells us that life is like a diamond laid on its side. So as we're coming from this point and life is widening, three people are very different from each other: Duchess, Emmett, and Wooly. And yet to themselves, this is just the way life is. Like, Emmett is a Midwesterner. Now, I'm from Colorado, but my parents moved from Iowa. So those Midwestern moments were very familiar to me. And one part that struck me was when the banker was sitting at the table writing out the foreclosure papers for Emmett's home, and he was wearing a short sleeve shirt. Now, that little detail was such a Midwestern detail to me. So I'm just wondering, there's regionality also going on in this book. It's a journey, it's an escapade, it's a quest, but it's also these American young men with a different perspective on what life can be. So I just wondered, is there a Midwestern part to your family, or I just don't know how you get to those details so well. And I suspect people from the Northeast felt that way about the Northeastern kids.
Well, I do think that, to elaborate on your observation, for the benefit of those who have not read the book, Gail is right that the three main characters, the three young men, are in a way representative of different slices of America. And there are other characters in the book that represent additional slices of America. But for the three main characters, Emmett is from the Midwest and sort of represents a lot of what that means, at least, to me as an observer. Whereas Duchess kind of grew up in a tougher part of New York, a very colorful and tougher part of downtown New York, and Willie grew up in sort of more of an aristocratic aspect of New York, going to boarding school and having a summer house and living in an apartment building in the Upper East Side. Whereas Duchess was really raised by a failed Shakespearean actor who ended up on vaudeville as vaudeville was dying, and became a sort of a drinker and quasi con man, while at the same time being in the dying vaudeville circuit, surrounded by other performers who were in the dying vaudeville circuit drinking and quasi con men. This is the arena that Duchess grows up in. Where while Wooly, just a mile away or 2 miles away in the Upper East Side is, it's surrounded by, dinner parties and silver and furniture that's been handed down through the generations, some multi-hundred-year-old WASP mentality. But, they're very different types of Americans, Wooly and Duchess, and as is Emmett. And I was in England not long ago, and I was sort of trying to explain this. And because, of course, the English don't have as much of a nuanced sense of what it means to be Midwestern or a New Yorker or a downtown New Yorker as we do on this call. But one of the things that occurs to me is that, as I was describing this to the Brits, is that if you think about the Midwestern sensibility, and my father was from St. Louis, so that's part of your question.
Oh, okay.
He was raised in St. Louis, so I would go to St. Louis every year to see my grandmother. They weren't a farm family. They lived in downtown, in the suburb of St. Louis proper. But nonetheless, some of my sensibility from the Midwest comes from that, and from many other sources too, but personal sources, I guess. But if you think about the Midwest and how it evolved over the course of the last 150 years, and again, if you weren't an American, what I would say to you, is that you have to remember that 150 years ago, it was still pretty much frontier territory. Is that in the 1800s, you still had people, many immigrants coming from the East Coast and moving because of land grants and the related dynamics into what was open prairie land. Mm-hmm. And you think about how challenging that was. It's a little bit like the Pilgrim story for the Northeasterners, but in the sense that there you are, you've got the land, but you got to turn it into something productive. Whether you're a rancher or a farmer, you've got tough winters, you've got tough weather, you've got the risk of failure at any given time, and that sort of dynamic, to some degree, I think, is the root of what is a very strong sense of Midwestern neighborliness. That you can go to a neighbor and ask for a hand, and they would give it to you if you asked for it, and would be there if you had a crisis in your family, and to offer help whether you wanted to accept it or not. And that's a part of it, because of course you have this community when as I say, 150 years ago, your farm or your ranch, you might be 2 miles from your nearest neighbor. You might be 40 miles from a physician. Your life could very easily depend upon having a good relationship with your neighbor. And they all shared that dynamic. And so that's a very shaping thing. Contrast that with what it would have been like to live in New York City in 1850, where if you lived in New York City, your survival might very well depend on being suspicious of your neighbor. The guy who lived right next door in the apartment, next door in the tenement that you lived in, or down below you or up above you. So those kinds of cultural impacts get carried forward, over a period of 100 years and shape how a whole community can behave. So yes, so Emmett is to some degree a reflection of sort of the hardworking, very pragmatic, no frills sort of aspect of Midwestern life. Not all Midwesterners are like that, of course, with a sense of being reliable and proud of it. Whereas Duchess is, from this lower Manhattan, is in a situation where he's much more outgoing, much more prone to exaggerate, to be colorful in the way that he speaks, having been raised among performers, and a person where what's right and wrong is a little bit more fluid. It's a little bit more situational, we would say. Because again, in New York City and in downtown New York, your sense of right and wrong has to be a little bit more situational, with you packed in with all these people and things moving a mile a minute. Or to some degree, an Emmett has the luxury of sort of looking out and saying, here's right and here's wrong, and that's the way the world is.
Right. Duchess always has to read the room.
Yes, of course. Right. As the way, and if you're if you're in a scrappy, living hand to mouth urbanite, that's what you do. That's how you get by.
So in addition to these three, we have Emmett's younger brother, Billy, who is 8 years old. And something that all of these people have in common is unfinished business. That just struck me through this whole book. There's all of this unfinished business that they all approach differently. And Billy, as an 8-year-old, I've read some reviews, and they say he's precocious, he's this. He's really, I think all of the adults recognize in him that he has not lost his sense of wonder, right? That is something that they all are trying to protect Billy and his sense of wonder, but he also has unfinished business. He wants to go find their mother who has gone to San Francisco. There's so much scope in this book. It's kind of, I don't want to introduce too many different things, but Billy as a character was very poignant to me. And he's really the one who was kind of keeping things together. Like when Sally was on the scene, Sally was watching out for him. And then she showed up again a little later on, always watching out for Billy. So, but I just want to go back, unless you have something to say about that, I want to go back to technique here for just a minute, because it seems in your books that you always build a scaffold for the reader. Like you're helping us go through these different scenes and stories, going, looking back, looking forward. And then finally, we're at this point where we can see the skyline of New York, which appears from different viewpoints when they make it to New York. So the scaffold that you build for the reader, I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but it's your technique as a writer that helps us get there. So as you said, this book takes place in 10 days, and the chapters are actually numbered backwards from 10 to 1. Like we're going to this ultimate point of June 21st, I believe it is, 1954, when the story doesn't really end. The story is going to continue, but we just won't be along for the journey. So you strike me as a restless, focused writer. So like you're looking at all kinds of things all the time and putting them in these notebooks, but there's a focus to it. For the potential writers in the audience, could you talk about that for a little bit? The way
that's a long question, Gail. Talk about what?
Well, reading, writing, and reading and writing, and trying to focus all of these kind of disparate inspirations into a book. It just like, I just want to know, how did you do that? how did you fit vaudevillians, Shakespeare, Ulysses, the Midwest, foreclosures, and also a nascent United States, like this time, this kind of quiet time between the Korean War and everything that came in the 60s? There's a lot. That's a big question, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, that is a question. Yeah, I mean, but it's many observations, which I appreciate. What can I tell you? Well, so I guess what I'd say is at the artistic heart of
Right.
the things that you're talking about is, I suppose, in my work. I mean, I'll say two things about it. Which is, the first is that when I set out to, there is a great tradition in both American and Russian literature of minimalism. Not the dominant tradition, but a significant tradition, right? And so in Russia, it's exemplified by the work of Chekhov, and in America, it would be Hemingway or Raymond Carver. Storytelling, which is very stripped down, very lean, and that's the beauty of it. Same thing with Chekhov, where very limited details, limited exploration of the interior life of the characters, but yet a very strong sense of the emotional situation which is going on, and potentially of what it means. It comes across through minimalism. When I set out to write A Gentleman in Moscow, I knew that book was not going to be minimalist. It was going to be maximalist. That the nature of the character, a 19th century aristocrat, who's watching kind of the Soviet Union apparatus break down the cultural world that he loved and admired so much, the literature of it, the music, the theater, all of it's kind of being dissembled by the Soviet apparatus for various reasons, and he has to observe that. And so I knew that he was, because of his personality, was going to be interested in sharing his viewpoints on music, on literature, on philosophy, on food, on anything, furniture, and it would be maximalist. And when I set out to write The Lincoln Highway, I thought I was going to be more minimalist in shape. And that's partly because Emmett's voice was where I started, and he is more of a minimalist observer of the world. But as I got deeper into designing the story and ultimately writing it, it became clear that the story really was going to be told from 8 different perspectives. And I remember telling my editor, I told him what the story was going to be: 10 days, 3 kids, head east. And he said, "Oh, that's going to be a great break for you, because that's probably, what do you think? What are you thinking? Is that a 250-page book?" And I was like, "Exactly." So and I ended up with something over 500 pages, because as the individual characters begin to express themselves, because those of you who have not read it, it is told from the perspective of 8 different characters and kind of moves back and forth, with a couple of 3 or 4 at the center who tell the majority of the story, and going back and forth between them over the 10 days. And so the book became maximalist in a different way than A Gentleman in Moscow. It wasn't this sort of 19th century sensibility where food and music and literature and philosophy would be naturally sort of flowing off the tip of his tongue, and therefore should be a part of the reader's universe in thematically of battle against between the 19th century and the Soviet era. What happened in this case is it became maximalist really as an expression of the idiosyncrasies of the individuals. Because to bring Emmett to life, to bring Duchess to life, there are 2 African-American characters of significance in the story. Ulysses, who's a middle-aged Black American veteran, who's a bit of a drifter. There's a younger African-American lives in Harlem, who was one of their friends, was Emmett's best friend from the work camp. As I say, you have Sally next door and others. As you're bringing each of these characters in and bringing them to life, they bring with them their own terrific baggage, right? So for Duchess, his father did Shakespearean monologues. So Duchess was raised hearing the Shakespearean monologues over and over and over, and knows the Shakespearean mythologies quite well, and so he has that. Sally was raised as a church-going girl, and this kind of young woman is rebelling against it, but but the parables of the Bible are very alive for her, and the language of the Bible, and kind of feeds her fury at how, what's expected of her in the 50s in America. So you take these characters to bring them to life, they're bringing with them these sort of details, which are that you need to sort of integrate into the story in order to fully understand their sensibility. In the case of Duchess, as I say, he's got this sort of Shakespearean monologue thing that he inherits from his father. As a young man, his father worked for a while as a maitre d' at a restaurant. It's very sort of exclusive and old school. And that's Duchess's great dream, is to have this restaurant where, he was so impressed with the owner, that the boxers would come and the mayor would come and the actresses would come, and, and everybody felt lucky to be at the restaurant, and lucky that the owner would come over and pat them on the shoulder. And, for Duchess, like, that's like the greatest job in the world. And, so you sort of bring that whole world suddenly comes into the book because of Duchess's personality and because of his interests. So, as I say, it all is coming from the people out. It's not like I'm saying, oh, I really want to write about this. I want to write about that. I want to write about that. I want to write about Hamlet. I don't. But suddenly you realize that in the invention of the character and Shakespeare's role in it, it's going to have to find a voice in the story. And now, you were asking to some degree, how does this get managed? Well, that goes back to the designing phase. Because, as I say, when I have the notion, I start to imagine it, I will spend several years designing the book in great detail before I write chapter 1. And actually, I grabbed this because, it's funny that you said what you said, because this is, I think, the first full notebook of material from the novel. What you can see is,
oh my gosh,
it's called Unfinished Business.
Oh,
that's the title of the book when I started. Now, this was July 2014. So, the book is coming out in, it came out in 2021.
Right.
So 7 years ago.
Oh my gosh.
I was designing the book through a series of notebooks, and then ultimately in a large Word document where it's being outlined, before I started writing it in 2020 in earnest. I guess 2020 or the end of 19. So it's a long process of design. And all these elements that I'm describing, whether it's Shakespeare or the restaurant, come up through the imagination and then are realized to some degree in the notebooks and then built into the outline from the ground up. But that's ultimately how you kind of keep all the pieces together, for me. Right. So for me, it's not a thing of where I'm sort of starting at point A and sort of leaping as I write to point B, C, D, discovering it as I go. It is much more thoughtful and advanced. Now, all kinds of things change as I go. All kinds of things are discovered and invented in the course of the writing. Many of the most important passages come out of that process. But there's a big design at the front end as well.
So there's an inspiration and then a form, and then the form inspires, and it takes time. It takes time.
Yes, and the way I put that is that paradoxically, the reason I'm such an outliner is because the outline is what allows me, when I'm writing a chapter, to let my subconscious run free. Because to write well, I think, as a narrative, you have to have the poetic sensibility in play, which means you have to have, your sensibility of imagery and of metaphors and of word choice, emotions, ideas, all to be coming from somewhere deep into the narrative. And if I don't have the outline, then I have to be focusing on now what's happening, where are we, what's who's at the door. But if I know all that, then I can really, as I'm writing the events, it can allow the more poetic aspects and, subconscious, dreamlike, mystical, however you want to describe it, that to influence the narrative. And that's ultimately what brings it to life.
Oh, that's just so fascinating. So just to shift gears a little bit, we talked about in an earlier conversation, your tour. I mean, you've been touring pretty extensively, virtually and in person, and how when the book first comes out, the tour is much different than once you've been in it for a couple of months, which you have now. So you've got readers telling you all kinds of things about this book, I assume. Has anything surprised you or Um, yeah, let's just start with that. Has anything surprised you that a reader has come up with?
They're always, well, I mean, first of all, readers will come forward with what, if they feel that there's a mistake, they may share
Corrections
that.
will be made.
They may share that. If you go to amortowles.com and you go to the contact page, the email comes to me.
Ah.
So yes, you can send me your complaints, although I prefer. But if you're going to send me a correction, that's great. But make sure you check it first.
Ah.
I can't tell
Yeah,
you how
do your
many
own
people send me-
fact checking.
Yeah, people send me corrections. I don't think that's true, and it's like they haven't even bothered to Google it. I mean, go Google it. Spare me, but
Oh,
But
that's funny.
so some of you get some of that, but that's not right. I don't think what you're really talking about. But a good example there, and I was I had the good fortune of being on Seth Meyers a few weeks ago, and we talked about this because he gets corrections, and he the whole thing where he describes the correction. So I was sharing mine, but and a good example is there's a scene, sort of a circus, which is sort of
a circus. We'll
sort
call
of
it
a circus,
right?
sort of an unusual circus. And at any rate, during the unusual circus, a large woman in a tutu rides out on a tricycle, and she's chased by two seals dressed as cops in the old stuff, sort of old school cops, and they chase her around the ring and out and back out through the gate. And I received a very nice email from a gentleman saying, I really enjoyed the book, and I thought it was terrific for the following reasons. He said, but as a 50-year marine biologist, I have to tell you that no seal would chase a tricycle. Seals do not do things like that. It's because seals don't cavort. Sea lions cavort. So that would be a sea lion, So I love getting that. Now, maybe so. Then I said because I will make changes from hardcover to paperback where I will integrate some of these kinds of things. And by the way, this is not an invitation for you to go online and flood me with errors, okay? But anyway,
we hope not. Anyway,
when I do the paperback, I will make some changes. But I did send this very kind gentleman an email, and I said, I love that what you've mentioned, and of course it's a terrific fact and no doubt true. My question for you is, would an 18-year-old boy from Nebraska in 1954 called it a sea lion or a seal? And he's like, they would have called it a seal.
Yeah.
So you have to make those decisions too, right? Which is the sea lion might have sounded weird, right? Because it'd be like, wait, how would he know it's a sea lion? So at any rate, so you have to. These are things, but the bigger, your question I think was more in the spirit of, are you surprised thematically what people do? And I think the bigger surprises for me are a couple of them, I guess. Well, first of all, I thought the book was not going to be well received as A Gentleman in Moscow. So, and I remember when I was beginning the writing process, I warned the publisher and my editor. I just said, hey guys, just so you know, don't expect this book to do as well as A Gentleman in Moscow, and for a variety of reasons, and for me, and so they read it and they were like, Amor, you're wrong. So I was like, oh, really? So, but it's been nice to see people really enjoy the book, and I guess I think part of it is the 18-year-old thing I mentioned. I kind of always felt when I was imagining the book that the 18-year-oldness of it would narrow the readership a little bit. But I think what's happened is that it in a way that you can't totally control, and you hope is that there's enough of the universality of what the young people are going through that allows readers at different ages to connect to what the characters are going through, and that which is terrific. That's it's if that happens, that's great. And if that was not your experience in reading it, I'm sorry. But one of the things that's been interesting is that having told the story from different points of view, which can be very challenging for both the author and the reader. Right? You're asking a lot of the reader to kind of pay attention and to, because the tone changes as the shift from character to character.
Right.
And you're constantly being interrupted in the trajectory of one character to hear the trajectory of the next. And the vast majority, I think, readers have found it's worked for them, and it's been a positive. But one of the interesting things which I did not anticipate was that people will, including friends and other colleagues, other writers, editors, will come to me and they say, oh, of course, Emmett is just terrific. He's really the center of the book, and da 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 da. And then you'll meet somebody else and they'll say, oh, it's really a book about Duchess, right? I mean, wow, it's all about Duchess. And, you know, and so, and somebody is Sally, but, you know, the nature of having an ensemble, you know, if they are fully realized and they have different voices which feel authentic to the readers, you've suddenly got 8 different people, or certainly 4 different people that the reader can choose to really align themselves with.
Mhm.
That certainly wasn't my intention, or I would never have occurred to me. But it's been nice to see how that has happened for many readers. And of course, to me, the favorite is when someone says that they really love Duchess. That's always, to me, the most hilarious, because, you know, because as I say, he's sort of he's difficult to pin down. He's a little slippery on the moral front. So yeah, when someone's like Duchess is their favorite character, that's always very revealing to me about them.
Well, you know, sometimes people admire the troublemaker.
Well, that's right.
Right. They wish they could be a little bit more like that. And the other interesting thing about Duchess is that his portion of the book is told in first person. I think he's the only first person narrator, right?
Sally is as well.
Oh, Sally, that's right. That was a really interesting. How did you come to that?
You know, this is one of the things that surprised me, because I never thought it was very interesting. It never even occurred to me that would stand out. But yes, this has come up a lot, I guess. So 6 of the 8 characters, it's third person, 2, it's first person. But I mean, from the writer's standpoint, I think what you have to appreciate is that I have not historically in my novels written in the omniscient voice. So, you know, the omniscient voice, and this great sort of Tolstoyan or Jamesian, you know, quality is this, you know, the person who knows everything about the characters, their backgrounds, their internal lives, their emotional struggles, what's going to happen to them in the future, what happens to them when they're off stage, as it were. You know, the omniscient narrator knows all those things and may or may not share them as the story unfolds. I have not written in that style. So to date, Gentleman in Moscow is third person, but it is a third person which is very closely bonded with the personality of the Count. So it is an expression of what he knows, what he observes for the most part, what his, you know, sense of humor is, what his sense of pathos is, what his vocabulary, syntax, his fascinations, his weaknesses. Those are all in the voice of the narrative, even though it's third person, so that eventually you really feel like you are experiencing, you're living the Count's life for a moment, witnessing it as he would witness it, seeing it as he would witness it. So in the case of the Lincoln Highway, you have these 8 perspectives, and yes, it's similar to that. The third person parts are each separately fused to the individual. So the third person of Emmett, is a reflection of his personality, much as the third person in Woolley is a reflection of Woolley's personality. So then it's really a question of what it sounds right to me. You know, because my third person and my first person aren't too far off from each other, really, at the end of the day, but they have a slightly different impact in the way that the reader is going to hear them, and a slightly different impact in how the character comes to life. And so for me, then it's really an artistic choice. As I start to hear the characters as I'm designing the book, you know, Katie Content in Rules of Civility was a first person right off the bat. Gentleman in Moscow, the Count, was third person right off the bat. And so in each case, the individual characters here, it's an individual selection based on what sounds right to me.
Right. Well, I don't think Emmett would want to be first person, right? He's a little more reserved than that, but Duchess would insist on it.
Exactly my point.
Right.
Now it's I know it's, I don't know when you want to open it up to questions.
Whoops.
It is getting, I want to give.
Oh yeah, we should pretty soon. But I wanted to mention one thing though about Gentleman in Moscow, since we're talking about that. It has been nominated as one of the, let me see here, I want to get this right, one of the finalists for the best book of the past 125 years at the New York Times. So many congratulations about that. And voting is open, everyone, until December 6th.
That is true. That is
so
true.
if you loved that book as much as I did, you might want to hop on to the Times and cast your vote.
Yes.
I think that's just terrific news.
That was very humbling, but yes, thank you.
Well, you know, don't you think I think anyway, that these books will be read for a long, long time. They're not just a flash in the pan anymore. That's how I feel about it. But let's go on to, we do have a few questions here, let's just go ahead and start. We have a question from Anne Marie who says, your 3 novels are so different from each other. Which one did you enjoy writing the most and which involved the most research?
I'm not a very research-oriented writer, so I don't pick a topic, research it, and write a book. I just tend to pick a topic that is grounded in something I know a great deal about. So I knew a lot about the 1930s because I'm a fan of that era when I wrote Rules of Civility. I knew a lot about Russian culture because I'm a fan of Russian culture and have been for decades. And the 1950s in America is in a way the easiest of the three in terms of it's the one that's closest to me in personal experience. But which is I'll make one quick point about that. One of the things that occurred to me at the end of the book when I had finished writing it was that I'd finished and I was like, oh, you know what? I bet my dad was about 18 in 1954. And I went back and checked, and sure enough, he was exactly 18 in 1954.
Oh my gosh.
And he passed away a few years ago. And I occurred to me that, all of us are so influenced by, call it the decade between 6 and 16, by what's happening in the world technologically, economically, culturally, whether there's a war, whether there's economic boom or a bust. That between 6 and 16, the state of the world in all these various ways has great influence on who we become as adults. But the decade in which our parents came of age has almost as big an influence on us, because of course that's what shaped them. And they're the ones who are constantly shaping us, but they're shaping us based on what happened, 40 years ago to them as young people. Right. So that's affected what they think is right and wrong, and how they think one should navigate the world. And so I think, it's very natural for writers to look back a generation and to write about that. And, and one of the interesting things is that War and Peace is not Tolstoy's era. That's his parents and his grandparents' era. The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, that's not her era. That's her parents and grandparents' era that she's writing about. Same was true of George Eliot in Middlemarch.
That's what I was just thinking.
Yeah. So it's, that's, I think it's very natural to, as I said, to reach back. It happens all the time in narrative. And we were a lot closer to that particular point in time than we think we are. But again, because of what our parents have passed us. Which was the most fun to write? It's always the most recent, I suppose. I enjoyed writing all three books in different ways. My memory of the pleasures of writing the book is strongest with the most recent, because like all things in life, in a sad way, it fades a little bit, and so which part of my children's lives is the one that I love the most? Well, remembering what they were like when they're 2 is harder than to remember what they were like when they were 14, and so anyway, it's a similar kind of thing with your narratives.
So Marcus would like to know, he says your novels are set in distinct time periods and places. I think you just answered this. Do they originate in interest with time or place, or does the plot lead? I think we've answered that one with time and place.
For Marcus's benefit, I will add that, so picture, like in the case I was saying earlier, the notion that struck me was a guy gets trapped in a hotel. That came initially as clean as that, because I was walking into a hotel and recognized the guy hanging out in the lobby from the year before as if he had never left the hotel. And so I was like, oh, wouldn't that be interesting to write a book about a guy trapped in a hotel? When I have a notion like that that's interesting to me, usually within seconds, minutes, it comes with certain attachments, as it were, or I can start to visualize aspects of it. So in the case of that idea, I immediately was like, oh, it would be in Russia. That'd be great. And it'll be an aristocrat under house arrest in a fancy hotel across the street from the Kremlin. And the story could be 30 years, it could be the whole Soviet era, or, Stalinist era. All of those impressions came to me immediately in the aftermath of that notion, like within literally minutes. Now, my mind would not do that if I did not know a lot about Russian culture and have a lot of interest in it. What made my willingness to leap in that direction is that foundation and the pleasure of being able to write about it, because I would like to write, so and that kind of happens in each of these cases. So it's not like I'm like, oh, I'd really like to write a book about the 50s. It's more that I come up with a premise, guy trapped in the trunk, and my second instinct there was, oh, this would be great. It'll be set in the 50s. He'll be coming to the Midwest. He'll end up in New York. It'll be 10 days. Like, again, all that came very, very fast. But then I have multiple ideas that are out there that I'm working on or developing at a given time, and so then it's sort of like, well, which one do I want to write next? And having written the 30-year saga set in Russia with the older guy, I was like, yeah, I think the thing I'll do is I'll do the project with the the 10-day story with the young guys in the 50s, as opposed to, idea number 7, which is, whatever, set in wartime France, or making that up, but whatever it was.
Well, you're working on something, I'm sure. Oh, yeah. Okay, so Claire wants to know, do you have any writing rituals or particular process that works for you?
I'm very process oriented, as you can kind of gather, I guess, from some of the things I've talked about. But yeah, setting aside sort of the outlining and the notebooks, and I'm at my desk right now, sitting at the desk that in my where we live in New York City, and I get up in the morning early, and I have my cappuccino and my bagel, and I do the crossword. But then I'm at my desk at around 8 o'clock or something like that. And I'm there usually from 8 to noon when I'm, in the midst of writing, as opposed to say being on the road or something. And then what I'll do is I'll go to lunch by myself at noon, and from noon to 1, I will then either edit the morning's work, so I'll print it out and start to edit it, or I will bring a notebook and I'll start thinking about, what's coming next. Not the next book, but I mean like the next chapter, the next scene. And by hand, I'll start sketching out how that chapter might begin and what might happen in it. And so that really helps me. So the next morning when I'm at my desk at 8, I can type in what was in the notebook from yesterday's lunch, and that gets me launched into a new chapter, so it gets me going.
The next phase. So the next question is also about the research. How much time did you devote to research? And I think what you're saying is you have these ideas, you put them in your notebooks. I'd love to see the notebooks. I wonder if we peeked in a notebook, if we could tell what's going to happen next. But she's asking about research for the Lincoln Highway.
I don't, like I say, it's not really a big part of my process. What I'll tend to do is I will do some applied research at the end of once the first draft is done. And so I did that with a gentleman in Moscow. I had never spent a night in the Metropole Hotel. And so when I started writing the book, I thought, okay, great. When I'm done with the first draft, I'll go live in the hotel. And that's what I did.
Oh, you did?
Took the first draft, flew to Russia, moved into the hotel, and began editing the process from inside the hotel.
Oh, that's so
but I postpone that kind of thing because I don't want it to interfere with my ability to imagine the story to its fullest in the way that is in harmony with all the themes and the events and the characters and everything else. So similarly with the Lincoln Highway, I had never driven on the Lincoln Highway. And so as soon as I finished the first draft, I flew to Nebraska. I went to a small town in the middle of Nebraska, which is kind of the basis of where the story begins. And I got in a car and began driving east on the Lincoln Highway. And that was, that's fun. But neither of these events, staying in the hotel, driving, changed the book very much, in any serious way. But I like to do that kind of work afterwards. And one of the things I did, which did affect the book a little bit, was when I was finished with the first draft, I went and looked at the front page of the New York Times for the 10 days in which the story takes place, from June 12th to June 21st, 1954. And that was fascinating, kind of to say, oh yeah, right, of course, this is what was going on, some of which was already in harmony with the events of the book. And, and the book is not a historical depiction, it's to be, but there's sort of the like, for instance, the Cold War was already in the first draft in this sort of small ways, a kind of gear throughout the story. And of course, that's what's on the front page of the Times virtually every other day. It's what Russia's up to. And so yeah, I'll do that kind of thing to look back, look, and now I might tinker with some things in the book because of what I do after the fact. I might add some things. More often I'm more often in adding elements that suddenly I'm like, oh, this is great. This is going to fit very nicely in the story and belongs there. And I'll sweep it into the narrative when I start to revise.
Oh, so interesting. Kim wants to know what authors influenced you early in your writing career or growing up. I know you've been a writer for your whole life.
Yeah, I pretty much started reading and writing at the same time in first grade. And so I'm 57. So over the course of my life, I've read many, I've studied, admired, reread many different writers of different styles and in different eras. And so in the course of my life, I have been a fan of, the American Renaissance writers, huge for me, like Thoreau, Dickinson, Whitman, and Emerson, Melville, of course, that group. I am a fan of early 20th century modernism, like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce and Hemingway and Fitzgerald, for sure. I love the 19th century British novels. And of course, the 19th century Russians. I'm a huge fan of the 19th century Russians and have read them carefully. But I also like, the magical realists of the 60s and 70s out of Latin America. Marquez is a huge hero of mine. I love the fabulists in Italy, like Italo Calvino. I read the experimental French writers of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, like Margaret Duras and Alain Robbe-Grillet and Sartre and Nice Nin and all those, crazy people, writing books where, there's no plots, no characters,
nothing happens.
But, so each of these things, books, these writers, these books have given me something to admire, to consider, have expanded the scope of my understanding of how the novel can work and what is capable of, and therefore have affected my, added to my toolkit, I guess.
Right. All that reading gives you better writing.
And
then finally we have a question from Vera Gale. Are you working on anything new?
Of course I am. And I can't talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it. But it will be different, because I like to do different. So, but maybe since I'm not going to go in that, did you say that's the last question?
That's the last one of what I've got here.
That's fine. So let me take a moment and I'll just talk about something else, because I'm not going to tell you about what's the new book. But I think I'll tell you something that I think is important about understanding the way I approach my work, whatever, or it's interesting, I hope, which is that I've really come to think about my approach to writing a novel is very much the structure of it in a way is very much like a stage play, a set, because if you look at a stage, so let's say you're going to a performance of Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard, something like that. And the sort of a big living room area and the French doors at the back, and through the French doors, we can see the actual cherry orchard in bloom, in spring, in the afternoon light. Now what we see, the cherry orchard through the French doors, that is actually in a stage set is canvas that's been painted, right? That's what's at the back of a stage set. And when they paint that, the cherry orchard, they don't do it, and you're going to use the Renaissance, tricks of perspective to give you a sense of depth, but they're not going to paint the orchard with hyperrealism, because that would look weird to the eye. If you were sitting out in the middle, looking across the stage through the doors at this trees in the distance, if it were hyperreal, that would look strange. And so instead, they do it in an impressionist style, where the trees are there, but they're sort of inexactly realized. And that gives a sense of movement and light and the afternoon all come across and sort of satisfy that sense of perspective from the audience. Now, in front of that, you might have a lot of stage work. The stage crew has built, for instance, bookshelves that are made out of plywood, but painted to look like mahogany, and they're there. And there's a door which goes nowhere, and there's a staircase that goes nowhere. It's a part of, it's been built by the stage crew to add to the sense of illusion. Now, in front of that, though, is an actual table surrounded by actual chairs on which there is an actual china tea service. And this is important that this be actual, because when the brother and sister, let's say, come in to sit down and talk about something serious, we need to hear that chair scraping across the stage, as he sits down. And when he gets into the heat of his argument, and he slaps the table, we have to hear that physical contact, the very real sense. And in response, when she patiently puts down her china cup, we have to hear the clink of the china cup on the china saucer in all of its patience. Well, it has to come across. And my point is that this is really the way that my novels are constructed. This is the layers of my work. So for me, history, we're asking about research. For me, history is the painted backdrop. It does not have to, it should not be hyperrealist. It should be impressionist. And it's going to give you a sense of depth, of an illusion of a sense of space, of a time of day, or whatever, of a location out there in the back of the stage. Now, in front of that is a lot of stuff that I've built using stagecraft, a lot of plywood that's been painted to look like mahogany, that you're going to read and say, oh, yeah, this is where, now I know where I am. This is where this is happening. Right. This is 1954. And that's a big bunch of artifice. But in front of that is really what I'm focused on, which is the table with the brother and the sister sitting in the Chinese tea service, because that's really where the action is. And that has to come across as very real to you, the reader, because the life of a novel and the impact of a novel is in the way in which these two characters interact. It's the expressions on their faces, it's the tones of their voice, it's the ideas that they're sharing, it's the sentiments they're expressing, and it's all the little details that are around them as they interact to connect as human beings. And this is really where, as I say, the action is in the novel. And so that's why it receives my greatest sense of priority. But anyway, that's the way I work.
And you do it so well. It's the details that I, as a reader anyway, are thinking about for days and days and days, these little connection details between the characters. Thank you for expounding on that, because I wasn't really sure how to express that, but that's exactly how it works. Well, I don't have any more questions. Do you have any other comments? I thank you so much for writing this delightful escapade. I loved it so much.
Thanks, Gail, for moderating, as I said, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Right. And if you haven't bought the book yet, please support your local independent bookstore. That's why we're all here. We love you so much, and we want this book to just fly off the shelves. It'd be a great gift for anybody.
Buy any
Anybody
book.
would love this book.
Buy any book at the Indie. Go to the Indie and buy any book you want.
Yeah, buy all the books. How about that? Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Amor, I'll talk to you next time.
You bet, Gail.
Thanks. Bye.